Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of The Deepest Lore. Reviewing Adam Curtis back once again, and I reckon, Simon, that nobody in the history of the world has done a dive as deep as this in Adam Curtis, because we are going to real obscura in his back catalogue here.
Yeah, I bet even Devon Stack hasn't done this series, has he? He did. I was told he did Century of the Self, and it was quite good.
Mainstream.
Yeah,
this is like the equivalent of being into David Bowie and going beyond Laughing Gnome to
that's it.
A very early kind of obscure Bowie record and so on. But
exactly, we did the singles and the B-sides and everything in between, even the flexi discs that might have been given out with magazines. That's the sort of level that we go to.
Yeah, Japanese limited
Japanese
single,
Yeah.
But anyway, here we are. Kind of an interesting theme, though, isn't it? Because
very much
it's how journalists report on war or have reported on war, which is something of current interest, of course, because there has been a war going on, the Ukraine-Russian one, but also of interest to all of us, given even now what you're allowed to say and not allowed to say about the World War II, and to a lesser extent even the Great War.
Yeah And this is my little intro take today. I think it's important to think about this film and journalism in the context of the Schmittian exception, the famous Schmitt exception we all love. What we think of as the Schmittian exception is kind of like the moment of uncontested oppression, the people versus power. Yeah, and it's kind of an absolute sort of iron door coming down on our separation from the elite. But journalists, they're a different breed. They see war, they see this as a potential crisis in the way the Chinese see the phenomenon of crisis. The ideograms for the word crisis in Chinese are risk and opportunity, melded together. And so, in reality, journalists know this, that, as Horace and I know, we love to quote one of our favorite films, JFK, the organizing principle of any society, Mr. Garrison, is for war. The authority of the state over its people resides in its war powers. So war becomes this path to sort of realizing and enhancing power by some form of intervention, literally mediation. And the journalist, like as the court jester would speak truth to the king of old, he sort of treads on that same territory of danger but potential reward. And in their own right, they become a castle, I suppose, a power base. They become exceptional in the domain of war. They're free to move in it and interpret it. And that's, why we talk about them as the fourth estate. That idea that I think came out of Burke and was quoted by Carlyle, that they are a separate and powerful part of our system.
Well, one of the things that interests me, and I don't know if you've come across any of this material, Horace, but little sideline, I'm a big collector of old obscure books, is that just before World War II, there was a kind of genre of journalists going over to Germany to see what Mustache Man's Germany was like. Probably the most famous one was by an Australian journalist called The House That Hitler Built by Stephen Roberts. I think it was written in 1937, 38. And I'm interested as to the fate of those books, basically, because they kind of after World War II, they kind of like disappear, or they're not really that much cited, and so on. Like, I'll give you an example, right? The prevailing narrative for all of our lives has been that the German people were brainwashed by propaganda techniques. But the observations of Stephen Roberts in that book is like, yeah, the Germans didn't really need that much brainwashing. They were kind of up for this, and he was there, like right in the middle of the 30s. Like, he was like, yeah, there was something in the German people that kind of like. And when I started to think about it, I was like, yeah, in the space of 5 years, this bunch of World War One vets managed to brainwash an entire population. Doesn't it? Like, when you start to think about it, it doesn't even pass the sniff test, right? That's just one example. Then again, Simon, when I look over at some of our friends in America, I wonder, over the space of 8 years.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, well, you made the point this morning in your video that Trump, I mean, within just a couple of months of inauguration, has gone from being the anti-war candidate to the just obviously just laying into everyone on Israel's behalf, just trying to be Israel in a way, and largely the base doesn't even seem to notice. So some people do just follow the leader, don't they?
Well, there's a kind of peculiar mode with Trump because he's vague and because he kind of never really explains what he's doing. There's a kind of like a kind of justification generation unit, and it doesn't even matter if the justifications add up. They just go with all of them all at the same time. Which I wonder if that sort of thing did happen in Germany. I know. Famously, the old mustache man would set up two. I mean, again, I don't know if this was propaganda that I was taught or if it's true, but he'd set up two dueling units to achieve the same purpose. Right? There'd be like the official department, and then there'd be like, I don't know, the SS version of it, or you'd have two lieutenants. You can task them both with, whatever the goal happened to be, and they may try to get there in different ways. But I've not studied that as intent. I mean, this is just stuff I remember from like GCSE A-level history that I studied. But any truth that he set up like dueling departments?
I haven't read a great deal about how he ran his government, but that's what they say in the documentaries, which are very mainstream, obviously. But they say he would knowingly give the same overlapping briefs to different people, different departments, and expect them to sort of prevail, like one to prevail over the other and get what he wanted done for him, and thus prove themselves to him. I think that was something that they did partly just because he had an indolent style as well. I think because he just didn't work that much compared to some political leaders. Didn't work that many hours of a day. He wanted results brought to him, I think.
But I also wonder if Trump does an element of this where, like, one of the questions we've had is, why does he keep people like Tucker Carlson around, right? Well, maybe he keeps Tucker Carlson around to keep the Zios on their toes, right? Why does he keep Steve Bannon around? Well, maybe he keeps Steve Bannon around to keep the tech bros on their toes, and vice versa. You know what I mean? Like, there's a coalition of dueling factions, and he doesn't actually mind if they argue with each other because it actually increases the stature of the leader, if that makes any sense. So it's kind of like a divide and conquer strategy where he just sits above all of these competing narratives, and in a way it kind of makes him more imperious or more like the actual king.
It's Putin and Surkov and that tension within the state.
I think it's also Farage and probably Mike Goodwin as well. Everything described in your slopulism video this morning, I just immediately saw that in Farage. Less effective, obviously. He's not actually the chief, but he uses all the same. Like Tommy Robinson as well. You join that movement and you end up arguing about whether Tommy Robinson should be in prison or not whether Muslims should be sent back or whatever, which Tommy Robinson didn't believe. They just draw you in and they waste your time. They draw you in, they waste your energy. They get you arguing with each other, get you arguing over things that don't matter. And I think Trump's camp is the master of that. I don't know how closely.
But you see, if Farage was Trump, he would have brought all of these disparate elements in a little bit. I reckon he would have brought in.
Farage is trying to copy him, isn't he? He's an imitator. He's not very good at it.
Farage is more brittle than Trump because Farage is very much it's me or the highway, right? So he ends up kicking a lot of people out. Like with Rupert, he couldn't stand Rupert Lowe challenging his authority in any single way. What Trump would have done somehow is set himself above the thing and let, I don't know, Lee Anderson and Rupert Lowe or Tice and Rupert Lowe hash it out, right? With him kind of vaguely above it. And he's done that. Trump has done that a lot. I reckon Trump would have brought in Robinson, would have brought in like Sargon, say, would have brought in, or I mean, even try to bring in some of us, and just allow us to argue amongst ourselves,
right?
so that there are different factions within the coalition, okay, but dear leader is strengthened by that. Like, because he's the ultimate authority. I mean, that is kind of like how a king would operate, or how even like someone like Genghis Khan might operate. A lot of the times, these kind of great men of history did allow a certain amount of dissension in the ranks. Like, I was reading about Genghis Khan before, and he even let like his wife arbitrate on some issues, and it's kind of like. They're not the absolutist dictators that you imagine. Some of these people, they kind of get off on these things. But increasingly, I mean, there's been these memes going around of Trump as Mao, right? Which are actually pretty clever, like pretty cleverly edited. That this is like American Great Leap Forward and things like that. But I'm constantly reminded of that film that Armando Iannucci wrote, The Death of Stalin, where there's a kind of prevailing line, and they all like it's a fascinating to watch that film. There's a little bit of that in there as well, I think, sometimes. And it came through in the Signal League, where they were kind of arguing about what the president wanted. Right?
Yeah.
It was kind of weird, wasn't it? Wasn't it weird? Anyway.
But that idea of Darwinian competition, I think, is kind of useful. But people, as you say, like Farage, are kind of too brittle to embrace that notion. I mean, I read about this in corporate psychology 30 years ago. The idea of, the companies that can do well may be led by charismatic leaders, but as soon as the charismatic leader leaves, they fall apart. So there has to be a lack of vanity, and there has to be seeking of talent and bringing in of talent in order for a company to have continuity, which is why it suggests to me that Farage isn't thinking in terms of continuity. He cannot choose an heir. He's too insecure to allow that competition to arise and to reflect badly on him in some way, as he would think it. It's a very insecure idea of even the Tories, have less vanity somewhat. They're very egotistical in many ways, but they kind of do sink everything to deference to the party. It's the party that's the ship that has to get through. It's not any one particular leader, even though they might lionize them. But Farage doesn't have that. He's the l'état c'est moi, the state is me, and that's it. And then that's why it's
Wasn't Louis XIV making an observation though, whereas Farage is asserting that?
Yeah,
as his desire.
Yeah,
but he considers himself all important. He thinks there's nothing to work with if it's not him. But I think he also sincerely opposes the real right as well. I think he genuinely finds the talk of mass deportations alarming. But he's a Tory. He's a Tory at heart.
There was a lot of, I remember when that fallout with the Lowe thing happened, it was about a month ago now. A lot of the people who were loyal to Farage were saying, like, without Farage, none of this would be there. None of this, like, there'd be no awareness of any of the grooming gangs or anything, because it was all down to Nige,
Honestly.
Which is just kind of,
the people he's got speaking for him on social media. They're really low quality, but they are some. I mean, they're quite hardcore. I see them on Facebook and Twitter, and they've got these certain lines. That's one of them. You know, he was talking about the boats. He was talking about this and that first. He wasn't. It's a complete lie. And just the other one is just, do you want Labour back in for another 5 years? They think that's a really good line. I don't think that works on anybody. Like even
The number one Tory line.
Yeah, it's so lame. It's so lame. So I can see Farage's thing just, unfortunately, it will just slowly wither over the next couple of years and just go down to like 15% or something, and just be a flop at the next election probably. Because there's no reason to get excited about it. They're just another Tory party.
Unfortunately, I've got a funny feeling that that might not be true.
Yeah. And they won't die spectacularly enough for something else to shoot up and fill the space. You know, they'll hold on. They'll sit there like the fat toad and just occupy the space. It'll be the worst thing.
I was thinking, by the way, because do you remember last week we talked about the Rolling Stones and we talked a little bit? I was listening back to that the other day. I thought this pre-match banter was pretty good. I might actually just cut it out and make a video out of it. Is that lazy? Do you think I would be lazy? I reckon they would make a good video for next week. What we discussed. Maybe I'll do the same this week. Because you know believe it or not, there are people who watch streams and people who watch videos, but not everybody does both. So you could actually hit different people.
I watch almost everything after time. After it's been on, because if you watch things live, you got to watch at the standard speed.
Right. So you listen to the Chipmunk version of everybody.
Yeah, just through. There's so much good content around, you know.
I've never been able to do that. So what I've done is slowly just cut down the amount of people I listen to.
I know a guy. There's a guy I know who lamented that he could only speed it up to double speed. He wanted triple. That's ridiculous. Something wrong.
Making min-maxing to an extreme.
I would like to point people towards the video we did last week about the control of the British over the world that endures forever. If people didn't watch that, it was a really good video.
In which you revealed you were thinking of going to the LSE.
When I was about 18, yeah.
Very suspect. Very suspect.
Which proves
government agent Horus.
Yeah.
How the British invented Horus.
He's a Navarra sleeper in our midst.
Do you know what's funny? We talked about George Soros on that video, and George Soros is that guy is working for Trump, like the guy, the black. Or was it the Black Thursday? What was it? What was the name of that event that happened? Black Monday.
Wednesday.
Black Wednesday. There we go.
In '92.
Yeah, that guy who was working with Soros, who made that happen, is now apparently behind these tariffs.
That's not Stanley Druckenmiller, is it?
No, what's his name? That guy. Dan was talking about him yesterday. What was the name of that guy?
Are we talking of someone of the Levantine background?
No, Besant.
Okay.
Scott
Is he British
Bessant.
as well?
Scott Bessant. I don't think he's British, but I think he is the current Secretary of the Treasury, who was a partner at Soros Fund Management, and is actually the mastermind behind the tariffs, apparently. So he is also the 5th openly gay man to serve at a cabinet level, apparently. So
shout it loud, shout it proud.
So, I mean, literally a gay Soros fund manager. You couldn't make it up, could you? Couldn't make it up.
It's a cabinet of the talents.
All right, before we get going, I would just remind everyone, do buy courses at the academic agency. And I hate to do it again, but I'm just repeat it every day. I have a spring sale on for the ongoing pleasant weather we've been having. It's promo code Mandy, ladies and gentlemen.
Country in which I have spent so much of my adult life and admire so much, 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 admire.
Promo code Mandy, 25% off all courses. Come on down, academic agency. every single course, 25% off. Promo code Mandy.
Admire. Country in which I have spent so much of my adult life and admire so much.
Oh, yeah,
So
may I make a remark on that? Mandy is actually a nickname for a certain substance associated with music, and people were moving to the music. I don't know if you knew that when you chose that as the promo code.
No, I didn't know.
May I do a quick plug before we start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just, I want to point everyone to the work of Gavin Bobey, who's been doing good stuff recently. He's challenging certain planning applications for certain, places of Islamic worship around the country, and he's been doing it for a long time. But recently, he's gathered a bit of momentum. People have been putting in funding that they haven't before, and it's enabling him to go after more. If people look at my pinned tweets, you'll see the latest one. I suggest we all help each other out across the country. Just a few quid. You can put in as little as £4. And it all helps. So just seeing the money goes up is just good for morale and good for the sort of momentum effect. And Gavin's doing great work. He's doing it for free, and I just want people to help out a little bit. It really is just a little amount of money, just still helps. So just see my pinned tweet, please. At Infinite Horus is my Twitter.
So this documentary, Simon, it's what's it called? Typewriters and Trumpets, a history of war, the history of war correspondence. I was not able to find out much about this myself, other than the guy who narrates it, the guy who and apparently wrote it as well. Curtis is in; he's the producer and director, I believe, but it's called David Jessel. Jessel, who was a news presenter. And has basically been a campaigner against miscarriages of justice for many years, and he's still alive. He's 79 years old, and still sits on all sorts of bodies like the Criminal Cases Review Commission. He was on that for 10 years, and is described as a tireless champion of the wrongfully convicted. I mean, I wonder if he's been involved in the that thing that Peter Hitchens keeps on going on about, the Lucy Letby case. I mean, I've completely ignored that. It's just one of those things that I see Hitchens talking about. I don't really even know what that story's about, but that's the sort of thing that this guy has been interested in. And it says on his Wikipedia page, it says his big break came reporting the 1968 Paris riots, May 68, which was a big moment, I guess, in the 1960s counterculture kind of thing, because it was the moment that how can I say it, like the summer of love died and became like the summer of hate, I guess. I don't know, and the failure. I mean, I remember reading lots of things before about how the boomer generation basically became kind of slightly embittered or resentful of the fact that their youth movement didn't actually go anywhere. When 68 died, and then they became like bitter corporate men for the rest of their lives.
Yes, I mean, this is the stuff that Adam Curtis covers in Century of the Self, doesn't he? This sort of moment where it transforms from the idea of attempting to change the state with its overwhelming power into changing what's in your own mind. There is a policeman inside all of our heads. He must be destroyed. All of that sort of stuff. And as you say, it's the kind of peak moment of the boomer crusader journalist, that rides on the back of things like Woodward and Bernstein in the US, people like John Pilger emerging, some of the journalists who are interviewed in this, in fact, who, a number of them are sort of, if you look into them, they are generally of the left liberal persuasion.
Seymour Hersh is another one.
Oh, yeah. So all of these
he's still around, isn't he? Seymour Hersh.
He's the one who broke the pipeline bombing thing.
That's right. Yes. So as you say, there's sort of a disappointment in the wake of Les Événements in 1968, and it had a profound effect on conservatives like Roger Scruton and probably Hitchens as well. I suppose they saw this was the dam breaking, and
and Thomas Sowell, who's been back in the news recently because he made a appearance at the age of 94 against the Trump tariffs. But I think he was Sowell was around because in America there's like a racial version of what was going on. Like that, not only was there a student kind of chimp out, but there was also like a racial reckoning in 1968 as well that was all boiled in, and they took over various campuses.
Yeah.
And I can't remember exactly where it was. It was at UCLA or somewhere like that. Sowell was working there, and people were like petrified because the students were occupying the campus in a militant way.
Yeah.
And he was one of the few professors who was like, yeah, you got to face this down. And basically the institution's cucked. They cucked to the students. And this is what basically made Sowell a lifelong hardcore conservative, basically. So
yeah, is that moment where they sort of, I guess, sort of, the radical pluralists began to emerge and sort of take away the ground on which these guys stood, and suddenly it became those sorts of situations again, like we saw with the black radicals in the Century of the Self, encountering each other, with the white liberals and saying, the reason we're here is not the same reason that you're here, and then it all becomes society is up for grabs. And these guys experience this sort of profound disappointment that the kind of I guess the humanist project of the Enlightenment isn't going to continue in quite the same way that they thought, and so they go off onto these crusades around the world to bring attention to these particular issues, and of course Vietnam breaks a lot of the spell as well.
Yes, David Jessel is actually on Twitter. He has 286 followers. He's got his own website, which is no longer online, sadly. He last tweeted in January. And he says things like, I listened to the Trump speech and my immediate reaction on Times Radio, then switched over to PM, who seems to have missed the story apart from a wary warm-up of disaster inquiry procedure. Where's the journalism these days on the BBC? Right, so he is coming. He's become kind of a grumpy old retired journalist. He also wrote a book, bizarrely, and he's famous for this. He won awards for it, called Brain Sex, which was the first scientific analysis of the differences between the male and the female mind. So,
beyond Ed Dutton shelf, I'm sure.
He also wrote a book called A Mind to Crime, which looked at the biological influences on criminality. So, I mean, this David Jessel could be like low-key based, possibly based on his interests and his general grumpiness these days. But anyway, in the 80s, he was going around reporting on atrocities in Honduras and Nicaragua. That's what it says on his Wikipedia profile.
That'll be atrocities by the Contras, not by the left, I assume.
I have no idea. We'd have to hunt them down, wouldn't we? But anyway, interesting character. So let's make a start.
Herbert Walden recording on January the 26th. Walden's in his truck. He's got 2 microphones out, but no protection, so he'll record for as long as the bombs will let him. The German flares are burning, hanging almost motionless overhead in the night sky, and a shower of glittering silver lights coming down from them. Here on the ground, we feel as if we were standing under the flares on a fairground. Every tree, every house seems clearly lit up.
War's easy to cover for a journalist. The events are made for you. You don't have to shake anything out of somebody. There are things happening in front of you. Planes being shot down. People dying, too. This is drama of the highest order. The news of the world can't compete with a war.
First bombs going down, it's away to the left of us. But even back here, the ground around is shaking viciously. And Walden's recording truck now rocking on its springs.
It was just exciting. Being shot at, even for a quarter of an hour at a time, is exciting. It isn't just looking back through rose-coloured spectacles, because I
So sorry, Paul. The News of the World doesn't exist anymore, does it?
No, no.
As a newspaper.
It was packed in over the phone hacking scandal, I believe.
That's
Yeah,
right.
it became the Sun on Sunday.
Is that right? Okay.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, and the Manchester Guardian that you see on screen there, Cyril Ray, that is the Guardian. It changed its name in I think 1959, but it started in Manchester, and I think like 1821 or something like that.
Was always sort of aligned either with the left of the Liberal Party or things further to the left than that, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Cyril Ray was a bit of a ladies' man, apparently. He said his ideal existence was to be on a sun lounger reading trash literature and having pints of Guinness brought to him by nubile girls.
Still better than old Miss Spring from BBC Verify, isn't it?
Yeah. Better quality of leftist in those days.
Higher caliber of gent.
Well, yeah, he was at, I think he was at Oxford. Yeah.
am remembering not now that all the men were brave and all the girls were pretty. I'm remembering that I thought so at the time. And, well, some of the girls were pretty. Some of the men were brave. But on the whole, this was the feeling that everybody, not only yourself, was sitting up on a peak.
War, said the general, is hell. To the war reporter, it can be very heaven. It's the best story in the world because it's the biggest. Instant history and a chance to change it. Exhilarating expenses and the opportunity for a little diffident heroism.
It wasn't a bomb, but it was an ambush, because when the troops arrived, fire was opened up from down the road.
Now,
Pause.
this is 83, isn't it?
This is 83, yeah.
So is this too early for Kate Adie, who was the actual queen of being on screen when bombs were going off in the background?
She'd been around. I mean, she was famously, at the Iranian embassy siege in London in 1980, and she was always chasing, especially the military and the SAS. She was always chasing them around. They called her Combat Kate, and she was always trying to, let's say, deploy her charms to get in on the act here. So
she was a bit like a kind of war challenge Annika, wasn't she?
Sort of, yeah, pretty much. They couldn't fend her off in the Gulf War. She'd be chasing them around out in the deserts, trying to get information. Yeah. I met her once actually at a film premiere. Yeah. She's very very enthusiastic.
Tell you what, Adie in her younger days.
Yeah.
Sorry to do this, guys, but Adie was a wood. He was a right look.
We were chatting at the bar. She stood very close to me, and she did smell a bit of drink, but she was standing very close to me.
She didn't go for your Gary Oldman charm.
Somehow it wasn't exuding sufficiently that night, but I could have been. In... I won't go any further.
Sorry, is that a posed photograph? I mean, she looks hot.
Of course.
Yeah. She on her Wikipedia page it says she is of Irish Catholic background, so that might explain the booze.
Come on, sit on the table, Kate. Bit of leg. That's it. Move forward a bit. Look to that. Yeah, that's it. Lovely.
Well, in my studies of who would you do when I ran that competition, I discovered a kind of alchemy whereby, I mean, now those of a more kind of ethno-nationalist persuasion will not like me saying this, but I kind of figured out that the hottest women were all half-breeds of various different kinds.
Easy now.
I mean, Jennifer Connelly, I hate to say it, who won basically everything, half Irish, half Jewish. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the ones who did really well had kind of backgrounds like that. The Latinas, for example, who did really well, had half Latina of some sort and half Arabic. And I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Why is it? And I just wonder if the harsher edges of each race are balanced out by, it's well, okay, you mix in a little bit of Irish there, that'll give you the blue eyes and, might kind of chisel off some of those other features, but then this background will give you the boobers and this background will give you the arse. Or I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it works, but
yes, the dominant features for attraction selection are kind of come to the fore, and the recessive ones are less visible.
Yeah, I mean, it was just an observation as I, we did
I mean,
six. We
these
did like
people
10
might.
tournaments.
The people, I don't know. It's just when you said about like half-breed, like people, women with a bit of Hispanic in them, I thought of Jessica Alba. She's a fine-looking woman, right?
Yeah.
But these people might be the product of fairly wealthy, upper sort of status, good-looking people. So it would make sense that their offspring would be good-looking, doesn't it? They may be massively over-representing their, they may be making their demographic look much better than it is on average, because we're looking at celebrities, right? And
I mean, there's a certain amount of natural selection there. You could say. I'm just saying that, like, who would you do as a very ruthlessly evolutionary Darwinian process, where and over hundreds of matches and thousands of votes, the data's not going to lie, basically, and it kept on throwing up like certain people again and again, and they all happen to have like, certain things in common. But anyway, let's carry on.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to hit pause there.
William Howard Russell.
Before we go in, actually, I should have just said, I forgot, there was a couple of little interesting sequences there in that intro to the doco. There was Winford Vaughan Thomas. He was a Welsh journalist who was at the BBC. People may recognise him from The World at War. If you look at the episodes about the war in Italy towards the end of the series, he's quite an amusing character. And that little clip at the end there of the journalist speaking in front of the building that was blowing up, that was an ITN reporter called Chris Wayne in 1971, and he was covering the troubles in Belfast. And he was at a building that had been bombed, and the IRA pulled their classic sucker punch strategy that when they bomb a place, the emergency services move in, but they've already planted a second bomb to go off when the firemen and the ambulance men are there. And that's what happened there, that the rest of the building was taken out as he was standing in front of it. But I think nobody was killed in that second explosion.
The Times man at the Crimean War was the father of war journalism, the miserable parent of a luckless tribe, as he put it. Russell, though, had all the luck, because he invented war journalism before the generals had puzzled out a way to stop it. Russell's reports of the Crimea's disorganization and heroic disasters reached the London Times by steam packet within 20 days. It took 23 days before the first Falklands battle pictures reached British television screens. Russell reported the blunders and bungles.
May I ask, does anyone know what a steam packet is? I've never heard of that. Is it a means of transmitting info, I guess? But
it's a ship.
Oh.
Yeah.
So it's just he sent it on a quick ship sort of thing?
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of medium-sized steamboat, I think. Oh. I don't know much more about steam packets than them, but I mean, usually they were sort of, I think, the size of boat that would sort of ferry people between, coastal areas, ports, over to Ireland, that kind of thing.
Okay. Good for mail then. Maybe
yeah.
Good for quick mail.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we lost AA there. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, isn't the lead character from Full Metal Jacket a war correspondent of some sort, or like a ward? Isn't he like there documenting what's going on?
Yeah, Joker and Cowboy, the two main characters. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember any other films that feature. There's that like 50s movie Ace in the Hole. Have you seen that?
No.
That features an intrepid journalist as the lead character. It's a bit kind of blue-eyed. I think it's a Billy Wilder film. So it has a bit of that kind of blue-eyed post-war idealism in it, But Ace in the Hole is an interesting movie. About the truth, the importance of the truth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is where we're hitting the beginning of this documentary with this character, William Howard Russell. It's the sort of entry of the myth making into the world of war journalism. I mean, if you're looking at sort of what people talk about in terms of the history of war journalism, they'll talk about, you can go back as far as Herodotus and Thucydides, talking about the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars. And, obviously there's various chroniclers of events throughout history, but not quite in the same mode as the war correspondents. And interestingly, I found that the first modern war correspondent was said to be the Dutch painter William van der Velde, and he did all these pictures of naval battles in the sort of late 17th century. But with the invention of the telegraph, essentially people like this guy Russell come up, and he's the early instantiation of journalist as a sort of vector of social intervention. In conflict, he's focused on the kind of the care harm issues, if you like, of the war. So he was very much focused on people like Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole, and he built up those kinds of reputations. He was concerned about medical care for troops, provisioning in the field, that sort of stuff. It's the journalist. He's kind of trying to seek purchase in this arena of power between rival castles to become one of them, and he becomes quite a bit of a nuisance. He brings down the Aberdeen government in 1855, from his reporting on the Crimea. He's described as, quote, a vulgar low Irishman who sings a good song, drinks anyone's brandy and water, and smokes as many cigars as a jolly good fellow. So he's a kind of, the classic clubbable, boozing, smoking journo.
I must be the jolliest fellow of all. Current cigar smoking habits,
but he worked his way up. He worked his way up the social ladder. He married a countess, an Italian countess. He was a Freemason. He ran as a Tory member in Kensington and Chelsea, and he was knighted. And he was kind of, it's this sort of archetypal journalist as social climber. That's what he was doing.
I'm trying to think of movies about. I seem to remember a movie about like exposing big tobacco, starring Al Pacino and Russell Crowe.
The Insider.
He was one of those guys. Was a journalist, wasn't he? I seem to remember.
Crowe's character was an insider at the tobacco company, wasn't he?
Al Pacino was the journalist. Is that right? I think that's
remember.
Right. Or he was like a TV producer or something. There was a few of them. There was that one by George Clooney.
Good night.
Good luck about Ed Murrow. Yeah,
I thought we would probably come on to Edward Murrow at some point because he is a very famous and consequential war correspondent.
There was a whole period where there was. Do you remember Frost Nixon? That was around the same time, wasn't it?
Yes,
that's quite good. That's quite a good film. Yeah.
I mean, it's this love affair with the crusading journalist, as we say, Woodward Bernstein, All the President's Men. That's kind of late.
All the President's Men would be the classic. Yeah.
In Frost Nixon, there's a crusading journalist type. I don't know if you call him a war correspondent, but he's very much a sort of a muckraker, I guess. Was it James Reston? He's a character in. He's played by Sam Rockwell in Frost Nixon. And to be fair, the movie makes him look like a dick, which is really funny. They make him look like a plonker, like he's really fierce, but when he's faced with Nixon, he's just really meek.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting that David Frost was like a character in that movie, like the David Frost that we knew as an older man. But in that film, Martin Sheen makes him kind of like a little bit swinging 60s and a bit kind of hip and cool, and I guess he was like mates with the Pythons and stuff, wasn't he? So,
this is what journalists had at that sort of time. I mean, I remember John Pilger in the 70s coming back from Cambodia, and he'd be on Blue Peter, sort of a denim shirt, kind of split to the waist medallion. Well, maybe not quite, but they had this kind of sort of wayward machismo. They were tanned, looked blonde and adventurous, and they were coming to tell you the truth, man, and to blow your mind with what the real dark truth of the world was. So they're very lionized figures, certainly in my childhood and memory.
That was before the left just became like corporate shills for the regime, essentially.
Yeah, but this is the key contrast. I think this doco sets up. You've got Russell, who is the kind of progenitor of these kinds of crusader journalists, and then in a minute you're going to look at General Sir Frederick Roberts, who brings the idea of information control by government, especially by the military, into play.
Right. And this is ultimately what George Orwell is about, isn't it? Because he was in some sort of like information department during
Yeah.
World War II, wasn't he? So
He also was a sort of war correspondent par excellence as well, because he obviously wrote a whole book about his own time serving, not only reporting, but
well, he went to the
Mm.
Spanish Civil War, didn't he?
yeah, charging up hills at one point, trying to take the enemy position when he didn't want to. But yeah, my experience of war correspondence was the same. Like that in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, they were really put forward as heroes. They really were.
Yeah.
Kate Adie's name used to be uttered as they'd introduce her. They used to utter her name like a celebrity. I remember that when I was a kid.
Yes, it's weird how the respect for the journalist is completely I mean, looking back, an oddly venerated figure that I remember when I was younger was Trevor McDonald.
Yeah.
He was almost spoke of in hallowed terms at one point.
Yeah.
Does anybody remember Trevor McDonald now?
I do. He was
Yeah.
at 10.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, well,
Yeah.
we remember him. I'm just saying, like, is he still in the cultural mythos? Is he still like venerated, or have people just completely forgotten about him?
I think he's remembered fondly by people of our age and older.
Yeah, I mean, there's a point of there's this term in broadcasting, the voice of God, the voice of authority.
Yeah.
We'll make a point about this later about, is propaganda something that's done to us, or is propaganda something that's in us? It's a need to have these kind of placeholder figures. I mean, and Adam Curtis himself, to be fair, gets this in his later documentaries. He speaks with the BBC voice of authority. He may be quite sort of left liberal, slightly radical even in some ways in his own views, but he establishes that notion of the calm, mannered address that people crave, in a sense, within what's I mean, I did a paper at university about the Falklands War and about media treatment of it, and I called it "The Clamour and Clatter of Tongues," which was I think a speech that Churchill had given that Margaret Thatcher had quoted in the wake of the Falklands War. But the massed confusion of pluralist voices in a social democracy, and that that kind of thing is what besets us now, where people are looking towards those voices. They're looking towards a Tucker. But that's how you swallow the propaganda in a way, isn't it?
In America, for a while, the voice of God was James Earl Jones, right? The voice of Darth Vader, because when CNN would come on, a voice came on saying, "This is CNN," and it was James Earl Jones who did that voice. I don't know if they still play it, but it's kind of interesting how that works, isn't it?
There's certain people who seem unthreatening, though, aren't there? Sorry, you was finished. Please.
Well, I'm just saying, it's amazing to think that all of that authority that the system had, that the organs of the establishment had, have been completely blown out the water in our lifetimes, like in the past 10 years, basically.
Yeah.
But anyway, go on, Horace.
Well, just when I was there's certain people who seem unthreatening or who don't cause you doubt. Like maybe Dan Rather is one, I don't know, but like James Earl Jones is someone who, I just know him as an actor. I have no idea of his character, but he just seems like an unthreatening person. Trevor McDonald was another one. When I was a kid, he just seemed pleasant. It's just like there's nothing to dislike about this guy. He may be bad in real life. I've no idea, but just on the news, he just had the news, the trustworthy newsreader thing to a T.
Yeah, he becomes, I guess, associated with that thing, especially, I suppose, in terms of the American neurosis of giving that sense of deep and ancient authority, especially to a black guy. You see it in a film like, do you remember Patriot Games, that film with Harrison Ford in the CIA? And of course, the sort of the trusted friend, his deep, kind of rock of wisdom in the CIA is played by James Earl Jones. He's that kind of that deep voice of authority. He just has that.
The word that I think of with Trevor McDonald was integrity.
Yeah.
Integrity. And when was the last time you thought of a journalist having any sort of integrity at all?
Michael
shills. Everybody's a shill on both sides. This is even in the Trumposphere, none of them have got authority. Like Laura Ingraham, all these people are just shills. Yeah. Sean Hannity is a shill. The CNN journalists have all become shills. Right? There's nobody with that kind of mixture of integrity and gravitas and so on, because everything became polarized. But anyway, go on, Horace. Sorry.
I just muttered Glenn Beck to add to your. be honest.
Not quite.
It's just not a figure I trust. But yeah, there's sort of, I mean, Michael Burke was another one who I've no idea whether he's a good guy or not. He just seemed unthreatening and just there's no problem watching this guy, you know. Whereas some people, there's a little edge to them or something.
I see Michael Burke. He must live around here because I occasionally see him at this little pub down the road. Obviously an older chap now, but
Does he read the news?
I don't think he's on. He hasn't been on TV for like 20 years.
No.
I don't think. But he's in his 70s. You know, people have to retire. So anyway, let's unless see David Attenborough. So let's carry on.
Of his war, and his reporting brought down the government. His colleague, Edwin Godkin, exulted. War journalism, he wrote, had brought home to the War Office that the public have something to say about the conduct of wars. They're not the concern exclusively of sovereigns and statesmen. But in the decades that followed the Crimea, the right Fleet Street had bestowed upon itself to give the public an independent voice in wartime was furiously resisted by the sovereigns, the statesmen, the soldiers, and their spokesmen. If war reporting traces its descent from Russell, the parallel art of news manipulation in wartime owes its inspiration to General Sir Frederick Roberts. In 1878, Roberts was fighting a rather indifferent campaign in an obscure part of the world, Afghanistan.
He welcomed the press on condition that all their dispatches were submitted to one of his staff officers for approval and for signing, and once they'd been signed, they could not be altered. In fact, he sent back one reporter who believed, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, that he had seen a massacre and felt obliged to report it. He altered his dispatch after Roberts had seen it. Roberts gets quite upset about this in his memoirs. He feels it was a breach of good faith and probably typical of the men of the press. But the ability Roberts had to dictate to a large extent what was or was not being reported about a war in Afghanistan very far away enabled him to establish a considerable reputation. He came back from that war with a knighthood, the thanks of Parliament, and a large money grant.
But it was Roberts' skill in getting the press to puff his career through the Boer War that landed him the top job of all. The press corps, including the young Winston Churchill, who was at times...
Boo!
Yes, he was a big supporter of Roberts, that's true.
He was still a Tory at this point, wasn't he, before he ratted to the Liberals? That was a few years later.
I'll make my apology for my Churchill tweet later.
Is there any part of his life where he wasn't a wanker, Simon?
I just when I put that tweet out yesterday, I just was looking over, when I was looking at the bit about Gallipoli especially, I just looked for bits about Churchill at the time, and all of the pictures of him, he just has this face of kind of icy hauteur and arrogance. And it just struck me, especially in the picture where he was surrounded by the soldiers, that he just looked out of place in a sense. He just looked kind of pallid and schoolboyish in a weird way.
I have read many accounts of Churchill basically saying like everybody hated him. Soldiers, the men hated him, the soldiers hated him, the commanders hated him. He was just a twat in all ways. Is that
When he was, I think in the sort of the decade, this is 1899, right? In the years before this, sorry, what?
So coming up to the Boer War, you mean?
Yeah. So in the decade before this, he was trying to, he's a young man, he was trying to fit in with cavalry regiments, especially. He was out in Burma or India, and he wanted to be part of it. But he was, although he was of sort of aristocratic descent, he wasn't the titled one himself, but he was of an aristocratic family, but not that well off. Like a lot of their money had just been frittered away, especially by his parents. He just couldn't keep up with the genuine aristocracy, like the genuinely rich guys. And he was always like, he couldn't afford, the horse, the outfit, the everything. Like it was all like a really expensive life to be a cavalryman. So he was like searching for a place in all these. Sorry, maybe I'm going off too much of a tangent about Churchill, but yeah, he was a try-hard at this point as well. So he's probably trying. I don't know, maybe not reading too much into this picture, but I've seen other pictures like this, and yeah, he's probably trying to look serious. He's trying to be taken seriously, but it didn't really have the means to sustain it. He's surrounded by much richer people.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I did a bit of reading about. I had a bit of comeback on the tweet I did yesterday, And you know, I mean, I did a bit of reading around it. It's difficult to tell from a sort of cursory examination. There was, you know, there was some accounts of Churchill, especially in World War One, you know, going off into the trenches, you know, as such. But I don't think he was the kind who was like there with his Lee Enfield rifle going over the top when the whistle was blown and being mown down by the machine guns. He was an officer visiting the trenches. But you know, I did have a few people sort of make the point. I mean, I actually kept all the tweets that people put out in response, and they said, "This is a stupid take. Churchill was personally in the Boer War. Well, he was a war correspondent. He was in the Afghan War, the Sudan War, and World War One, all before commanding Britain through World War Two." And people have taken issue, saying, you know, his personal bravery was not in doubt. There's sort of anecdotes about, you know, shells landing near him, people being shot next to him while he was, you know, in World War One. So at this point, I apologise. All those people were right, and I apologise unconditionally. Churchill was, and he remains, an unquestionable, unalloyed good for the country and its people in every way, at all times, from his birth and for all time to come. Anyone who says otherwise is giving a stupid take.
I think the truth of that stuff is a mixture, by the way. There probably were instances, like in school, he seems to have been recklessly brave. He used to do things like stunts to show off to people, but there were actually, you know, braver than almost anyone else would do. Stupidly, there was one time in school when he knocked himself out cold, and he was, I don't know, not a coma, but he was out. He was unconscious for hours, maybe, and recovered over weeks because he just jumped off a bridge from far too high. And stuff like this. Like there were times when he was like recklessly courageous. Some of the stuff about him in battle was probably made up and embellished. There was times when he was reporting on his own actions and there was no one else around to corroborate it, but it was believed because it was a good story. And then his biographers later are often, like most of his biographers, are just hagiographers, and they just seize on everything that makes him sound good. So it's both. I think he did have some courage. But it's not particularly the kind that you'd admire. He was mad. He was a bit mad, like with his courage. You know, he's a little bit reckless, crazy.
Well, Horace, I suggest that you pay attention to this tweet. This was the last criticism I got yesterday. Someone said, "You could scarcely be more wrong. I suggest you read Andrew Roberts." That's right. Me told.
Andrew Roberts maintains that Churchill was drunk only once during the whole Second World War. I find that doubtful, and he insists on that. He says that is a fact. That's not even objective. How can you even say?
No.
So anyway.
Can I just? I've discovered some things about Michael Burke, Horace, that might interest you. He's become a bit of a reactionary, Michael Burke.
Yeah.
At the end of 2012, Burke's despaired at the state of Britain and of the BBC, of the corporation's coverage of the Thames River pageant celebrating Britain in the 60th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's accession to the throne. He wrote, "The Dunkirk little ships, the most evocative reminders of this country's bravest hour, were ignored so that pneumatic bird brain from Strictly Come Dancing could talk to transvestites in Battersea Park." He then said in an article for the Radio Times in April 2014 about grey power in television, Burke referred to presenters who would have gone to employment tribunals over claims of age discrimination. Several older female presenters have won cases over wrongful dismissal. Burke wrote, "If you got a job in the first place, mainly it's because you look nice. I can't see why you should keep it if you don't." Quoting a comment by Anne Robinson, "The viewers don't want to watch ugly," he speculated.
True.
He seemed to say it through gritted teeth, or at least a flawless but strangely taut face, a sign perhaps that she had taken her own advice to stop complaining and work on staying attractive. He said the rules that apply to women in TV don't apply to men. Men can age, women can't. Women have to be attractive, men don't. He then said in 2016, Michael Burke was critical of Emma Thompson, Benedict Cumberbatch, and other celebrity liberals. He said in an interview with Ross Kemp, "I hate it when feather-bedded thesps pay flying visits to the desperate to parade their bleeding hearts and trumpet their infantile ideas on what must be done. There's only so much of the Benedict and Emma worldview that you can take." In 2019, it was reported that Burke thought that the obese should be allowed to die in an early death in order to save the NHS. In an article in the Radio Times, Birth suggested allowing deaths due to obesity could benefit society. He also added, see it as a selfless sacrifice in the fight against demographic imbalance, overpopulation, and climate change. In October 2024, in an interview with BBC Radio 4, Burke accused the BBC of excessive media coverage following the death of One Direction singer Liam Payne. Burke was criticised for referring to Payne as a drugged-up, faded boy band singer in the same interview. So there we go. He is revolting against the modern world since he retired.
Yeah.
A solid list of remarks. That's good.
Interesting talking about obesity there, because of course Michael Burke is made his bones, is famous for his reporting from the Ethiopian famine in 1985, if people remember.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
His famous the scene opens, or is it the dawn opens on a scene of biblical suffering or something like that? Is his phrase.
Well, next time I see him in that pub, maybe I'll sidle over and be like, I'm a big fan of the controversial remarks you've made over the past 10 years. So, you know.
Anyway. Like, yeah, I don't want to have a chat about it. Can you shut off? Leave me alone.
Yeah, go away. Who are you?
Talk to journos. Fuck off.
Capable of writing splendid eyewitness stuff about triumphs he hadn't actually seen, helped make Roberts the darling of the public, the hero of the hour, and Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. Russell, by now living out his twilight days in Dover, protested in vain about his gullible and sycophantic colleagues. He'd seen the craft he'd created enter the 20th century in a corrupted and irretrievably compromised form, as the mere chronicling of the power of generals and the glory of war. The Great War was intended by Lord Kitchener to be the war to end all war reporting.
Pause.
Press, the new war minister growled, there isn't going to be any...
Just before we go on to the First World War here, but there are interesting things about General Sir Frederick Roberts. As I say, he brings in this sort of attitude towards controlling the press, which Kitchener then takes on and advances with his own dedicated press corps. But Roberts himself was kind of he was your classic empire man, and he was very interested in a number of things. One in particular was that he was very fascinated with the idea of the martial races, and bringing because of the size of and scope of empire, bringing into the army Highlanders, Sikhs, and Gurkhas, and if you like, sort of creating that sort of discourse around lionizing the warrior, but the warrior in the sense of from all corners of the empire. And in particular, he had this interesting speech he made once as well. This is another idea that he made a speech in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester in 1912, and he was pointing out that the Liberals, that their prediction of peace and universal disarmament would follow the adoption of free trade hadn't happened. I just thought there was an interesting resonance there with the ideas, Clinton's ideas about China. Back in the day, so he was kind of at the same time, both a realist, but he was also drawing into a sort of internationalist sense of serving the empire. Perhaps in a similar way when, Oliver Stone interviews Vladimir Putin, he does point out and says, look, I am kind of running a multicultural society, and we accept it, in Russia much more so than the West does, because there's all these former Soviet satellites that I have to bring together that stretch as far as Asia. So you can't accuse me of, just being some kind of, monoracial Russian nationalist, So there's an interesting idea about integration across the scope of empire.
I would say that the veneration of the Gurkhas is one of the most successful campaigns ever, because even now, I would say that mythos is very strong. If you bring up the Gurkha, I just imagine a chat with the Lotus Eaters lads, and if anybody brought up the Gurkhas, they'd just be falling over themselves, loving the Gurkhas. Yeah. I mean, I have a positive view of them as well. I'm not dissing anybody. I'm just saying that it was a very successful campaign.
They're tough guys. Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm just saying they have an almost universal good name. I would also say the Scottish regiments as well. Everybody has got a positive view of them too, I would say.
They're the most enthusiastic soldiers of the British Army. I mean, that song that's playing in the background in this clip is a famous Victorian song, Soldiers of the Queen. You know, the lyrics go, "It's the soldiers of the Queen, my lads, who've been my lads, who've seen my lads, in the fight for England's glory, lads, when we've had to show them what we mean. And when we say we've always won, and when they ask us how it's done, we'll proudly point to every one of England's soldiers of the Queen."
So, just continuing, Simon, did he just say that Lord Kitchener banned war correspondence as soon as he took over?
Kitchener, he didn't like the press at all. He called them drunken swabs. I mean, in fact, there was a thing called the Defence of the Realm Act in 1914, which I mean, for the first, I think, I don't know if when it was passed or if it was just debated and then passed in an amended form. I think it was passed first and then amended a few months later. But in the first iteration of it, it gave them the power to actually to shoot journalists if they needed to. He actually allegedly, Kitchener allegedly sort of he said he was said to have talked wildly about having a particular journalist shot. You know, there was a guy called Philip Gibbs from the Daily Mail. And he refused to come back to the UK from the front because his reporting was a bit too close to the truth, and he was arrested and detained. And apparently, someone in Kitchener's office said that if he came back to France, he'd be put up against a wall with unpleasant consequences. So Kitchener was quite in favour of reining journalists in the most severe way. The actual Defence of the Realm Act, though, was amended a few months later to exclude British citizens from being, shot for, spreading disinformation, I guess, essentially is what they would have thought of it as.
Quite a big exception.
Yeah.
I just, for anyone watching who's not aware, like the Daily Mail has not changed that much. Sounds like it had the same sort of approach to journalism back then, 100 or 110 years ago, as it did now. And it was they just specialise in luridness above everything else, right?
Yeah.
Same with the Express, but just the shitter version of it. But Lord Northcliffe was the owner. I think it's Alfred Harmsworth was his name, and he was the owner of the Daily Mail at the time. And then it went to his son later. And I mean, they were supporters of the war and stuff, and they were supporters of the government, of the wartime government. And I think Northcliffe was actually brought into the cabinet as well, as was Lord Beaverbrook, who owned the Express. But all the same, like, they sort of distinguish themselves, and I guess partly tussle against the government as well by having these reporters who will embarrass the government as well. That seems to be a thing. But yeah, the Daily Mail, I mean, it's like, it's mostly dog turd, like the reporting and stuff, but there is some good journalism, or there is some good investigative journalism in the mix at times. And it's such a strange phenomenon. It's like, it's the right wing thing, but it attacks the right wing, and it's such a strange newspaper.
Did they? I wonder if they kept on. I wonder if there was an Edwardian version of Peter Hitchens, the Daily Mail, that kept on during the things have not been good since Queen Victoria died, and all this sort of stuff. I bet you there was a figure like that. I mean, in a way, Carlyle was a bit of a Peter Hitchens character in his lifetime as well. And anyway,
there certainly seems to have been a tension. I mean, with Kitchener especially, there was this thing called the shell scandal in 1915, where basically we didn't have enough high explosive shells, and it was seen to be obviously a major failing and deficiency in military planning. And it was sort of tagged to Kitchener, and the criticisms he got. I mean, this is a bit of a sort of I'm throwing a little bit of red meat here, but there was a suspicion that Kitchener was a homosexual. And that somehow, therefore, the journalists felt they could sort of take a few more swipes at him, because, obviously at that time it would have been a grievous kind of accusation and thing to have to deal with. So he was kind of sort of maybe held over a barrel a little bit, and he had to kind of come to terms with journalists by the end of the war. But he had this press corps that he set up because, he wanted to ensure that there wasn't this kind of stuff that you'd seen with the Crimea, with information coming back.
Do you think that the liberal establishment did a real number on the World War I command? Because my mind automatically goes to Stephen Fry whenever I think of these guys.
You shot my speckled gem.
darling. Did you think that they just did such a number on them because they kind of made a mockery of the high command of World War One?
I think that comes from later, from things like Joan Littlewood and the Theatre Workshop doing "Oh, What a Lovely War" in the 60s. Yeah, so sort of nailing it firmly, that led by donkeys, etc.
Richard Curtis as well.
Yeah. So again, sort of more retrospective myth making. But I mean, there was enough, I think, sort of tension within the way the military was trying to operate and the way that journalists were trying to kind of liberalize it to some extent. But in this first sort of phase, the military certainly, pulls the journalists into line.
Just before we resume, I didn't quite finish my thought about Northcliffe. I forgot. He was a factor in the. I don't know if you guys would talk this, but the shells crisis, the ammunition crisis.
That's the one, I mentioned.
That came in 1916, I think, and that was what brought down the Asquith government. And I don't know whether Asquith was considering some sort of peace, because Woodrow Wilson tried to bring about a peace before America got involved. But anyway, that's what led the ammunition crisis. It's called the shells crisis, I think.
Not May 1915 is the date I've got here.
15. Yeah. Oh, so that's really early in the war. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's only 6 months into the war then. Or eight or 9 months. But that's what brought down Asquith, he was in favour of the war. He did partly cause it, but brought him down for Lloyd George, who was just a extremely unprincipled man who literally would expand and carry on the war for his own political career, and did so. And Northcliffe was a factor in that. So that the Mail in particular was a factor in changing government in the middle of the war and probably prolonging the war for a long time. I'm not enough for an expert to talk about it clearly, but people might want to read more.
And at the same time, they took advantage of the moment. They passed what's called the Munitions of War Act, which allowed them to do things like, commandeer factory production and ban strikes. Right. So you got labour control out of it.
And that's how Britain became more gained more of a war economy rather than its previous more natural economy that was, cottage industries, home industries and stuff. This is what started making Britain have to have massive factories, organised production lines, basically organised by the state, dirigisme, war economy, really killing off the old world.
The whole lions led by donkeys narrative. I mean, is it basically true? Because I mean, I remember reading stuff like, when World War One started, that the captains would hold up their swords and the Germans would just shoot them. The captains would just be killed. Because they went in without dated tactics, and then they never really developed beyond go over the trenches type thing and get shot by Germans. I mean, is that in people's views of World War One now? Is that basically still standard, or is there kind of World War One counter revisionism or something?
I'll defer to Horace on history, but I think there's an element of, let's say, struggles of power factions within the establishment. It comes out a bit more when we get to Gallipoli, and we talk about the way the British officer in charge of that operation was sort of smeared, essentially, out of the way, and it gave traction to certain powers in the press. Who were cozying up to government at that time. So this sort of the sense of, again, myth making about, displacing the martial establishment in favour of the journalistic establishment, perhaps does come out, and there's something to be done there.
The other thing I was always told about Lloyd George growing up was that the Welsh didn't want to fight. They didn't want to get involved in this war. In World War, they didn't want to fight in World War One, so Lloyd George literally did a tour where he went round to the pits and went down and gave patriotic speeches to the coal miners to stop them going on strike and to get them involved in the war effort and get them involved in enlisting and all the rest of it. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but I was always told that this is a weird thing, is that people did not have a positive view about Churchill in Wales when I was growing up, but they also didn't. I mean, really not, because whenever he was brought up, that line would always be "Oh, get the rats back down their holes." That was the. So the Welsh don't like Churchill, but also they don't really have that much of a rosy picture of Lloyd George.
Was this Horace would know about this? Is this when Churchill would turn the troops out on the miners at Tony Pandy or something? Is that...
Yeah, there was more than one instance. I think Pontarddulai as well, and think there might have been another incident when, like there was riots in Welsh mining towns. One of the riots wasn't over mining. I think it just happened to be in a mining town. There's another time when it was miners rioting as well. And Churchill was trigger happy. Yeah, he was eager to send in troops. He thought that was fine. And he also told the judges in the area to be harsh and stuff on rioters and stuff. He was there was a lot of reason to hate him in Wales. And Lloyd George was probably his closest ally in politics as well at the time.
Interesting.
You're joining us on Academic Agent Channel for another Churchill hate stream. We'll continue.
but Lloyd George was probably like a suitable person to send, apart from being senior anyway. But because he was Welsh, and he wasn't like Neil Kinnock, where he sort of downplayed his Welsh identity. Like he would use it, and he had a strong Welsh accent. Neil Kinnock had a strong accent, but he always said like Wales is just a province of England and stuff. So, but Lloyd George could actually plausibly play up the Welsh nationalism a bit if that was needed.
I think it was success. I think his patriotic speeches were successful, but it was also remembered that people didn't want to go as well. And I don't know how much of this stuff is written about, and how much is kind of like passed down folk history, like oral history in Wales or whatever. But yeah, I never got the impression that it just wasn't seen as like their war for some reason. But anyway, let's carry. There's a lot of resentment against the British ruling class in Wales in general. Or at least there was when I was growing up.
I just had one thing. You just mentioned about Edwardian stuff as well. Just in the decade before the First World War, obviously that was King Edward VII's time as king. He was crown prince for a long time before that as well. Prince of Wales for a long time before that. But in his time, especially and it was his action that like a lot of press barons were made. They were literally ennobled, which was not a normal thing until then. The press was not looked upon as such a sort of high thing. But it became a thing that you could get close to the king and be ennobled for during that first decade of the 20th century, and that would have been the making of like Lord Northcliffe, Lord Beaverbrook, who was from Canada, and Lord Levi Lawson, who founded and owned the Telegraph. And the ownership of the Times has never been quite so clear, and it's not clear who you were ennobled for that. But yeah, like press barons were created in the decade before the First World War. So.
Yeah, Lloyd George, I think, is the only Welsh Prime Minister. Correct me if I'm wrong. Don't think there has been another one. Kinnock would have been if he become the only like real kind of Welsh political figure who I remember fondly being talked about by everybody was Nye Bevan.
Yeah,
everybody loved Nye Bevan.
There's literally a play on at the National Theatre about him at the moment, I think.
Everybody loved
it. So. All right, let's carry on.
Damn press till this business is over. He was backed by the young First Lord of the Admiralty. A warship in action has no room for a journalist, said Winston Churchill. But mass mobilization created a mass appetite for war news, and wars sell papers. So the press lords forced Kitchener to send this small group of 6 accredited correspondents to the Western Front. They were billeted in chateau and hotel.
So that's a curious comment. They forced Lord Kitchener to send their correspondence out. How interesting. What does that mean? They forced him. I don't know if anyone's got the answer to that. I just thought I'd mention that.
At a discreet and comfortable distance from the actual fighting. After breakfast, there would be a briefing. Then they'd be taken to look at appropriate parts of the trenches, demurely chaperoned by senior officers. At tea time, they would come back and prepare their...
Was Roy Jenkins Welsh?
Yeah, you wouldn't know it from his accent, but he was from about 10 miles away from Nye Bevan.
Yeah, Jenkins. I mean, Jenkins is a very Welsh name. I had mates called Jenkins, and then when I was growing up.
Jenkins.
I think his dad was in the miners' union, but he was a fairly senior rep, like a regional boss of the miners' union. And Jenkins grew up with a car and private school and stuff.
As we've discussed before, a pure villain in the history of politics. Roy Jenkins.
Absolutely.
Pure villain.
I read his biography of Winston Churchill last year, and you can get the measure of it from the last sentence, which is basically he is the greatest prime minister we've ever had, the greatest of all.
Fuck's sake!
1,000 pages of that. Yeah.
Elegant copy for submission to the censor.
The aim of the war correspondence was to write material as fast as possible, in as finished a manner as possible, but also, because of the speed necessary to get it back for their deadlines for the newspapers, they would also attempt to write dispatches which would get past the censor. And I think that they fitted very easily into this situation because the censor, the British Army, if you like.
Hold on. That guy dissing the Welsh in the chat, you're banned. I won't have disparage. I won't have the Welsh being called cowardly. Come on, get out of it. For England, I mean, I'm not having it. I'm not having it. Get out.
We mentioned the martial races earlier. Like the British forces have recruited many fine warriors from Wales. Wales has contributed to the empire and to everything else. A lot of Welshmen fight with great valour. And Irishmen as well. There's always been Irish regiments in the British Empire.
I mentioned he's banned, and Robinson is banned. Do you remember when she dissed the Welsh? That was a big scandal.
I mentioned on a previous stream my late friend in the SAS, who was one of the hardest men in the regiment, was Welsh.
And it's not true that they're all anti-English either. Loads of them don't give a shit. Who else?
Thanks to them, just like to fight as well.
When we grew up, I'm sure it was quite common for the Welsh to be the butt of jokes, like Irish people maybe still are.
Yeah,
you know, like it was Jeremy Clarkson always used to have a dig at the Welsh.
Yeah, it's true as well.
Became their editor.
The correspondents were courtiers in the Palace of War. When King George himself came to visit the front line, the gentlemen of the press, already flattered by their elevation to the squirearchy of the officers' mess, toured with him. Journalism, socially a rather suspect pursuit, basked in its ennoblement. The War Office had, in selecting them, made sure they'd know how to behave. These secret reports show the sort of qualities that were required of World War I's correspondents. July the 1st, 1916, was a day perhaps for being indiscreet. After pounding the German lines for 6 days and nights, the army would burst out over the top and roll the enemy back to the sea. It was to be the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and for the journalists, a day to rise early.
They stood on the top of their hill 4.5 miles from the front in a beetroot field on a summer day, with larks singing overhead, with the Daily Mail war correspondent who'd been Lord Northcliffe's nature correspondent chasing butterflies. Unfortunately, when the attack went forward at 7:30, mist, the early morning mist, still obscured the whole of the front that could be seen from the war correspondent's hill. And all that they knew of this dreadful attack that went forward was a deepening roar, which was the increasing bombardment, and what they described as a rushing sound, which was the hail of machine gun fire and rifle fire, which came as the troops went over the top. But apart from that, they couldn't see anything. By midday, the mist had cleared, but there was nothing to be seen because 20,000 British soldiers were dead, and the ones that weren't dead had crawled back to the British trenches.
Pause. This guy speaking, just out of interest, Nick Hiley, he's a historian, but as you see on the screen, he's with the Open University. He is somewhat of a socialist, I will say. Most of his concerns are for... He was mostly concerned with the campaign exonerating the name of Alice Weldon, who was a socialist who was wrongly convicted of conspiracy to murder Lloyd George in 1917, which used false evidence provided by essentially intelligence services agents. And he's done a lot of work on intelligence services monitoring of trade unions and leftists and so on. So he's a big defender. So don't be fooled by his smart suit and nice hair.
he's got a touch of the Mandelsons about him, doesn't he?
Yeah, his languorous kind of manner.
I can imagine. I admire so much.
That is a thing. That is a real bugbear for certain socialist journalists, isn't it? The sort of malinterference of the intelligence services in their cause, but not in anything else. Like when the spy cops thing, they were absolutely mad over it. That the intelligence agents had infiltrated the Green movement and this and that and animal rights. They just thought that was appalling and outrageous because we're compassionate people. How dare you? That stuff's supposed to only be used against the nasty people on the other side. It's it's very partisan.
He tends also to play down the effectiveness of things like propaganda in his kind of desire to sort of, I guess, attack the establishment somewhat. He argued that things like the famous propaganda posters, the very, very well known one, "Daddy, what did you do during the war?" That poster people would have seen. He argued that really that wasn't terribly effective. It was more that people later on it resonated with them because it was distasteful about war. But he didn't think that propaganda worked on people.
For some reason, I just get the impression that this guy hung out with Stephen Fry in real life. That's the kind of vibe I get from him. But anyway, let's carry.
I just wanted to pick up on one thing. Just then, they mentioned that the war correspondent for the Mail on the morning of the Battle of the Somme, the first day, there had been the nature correspondent, and was just told to become the war correspondent. And I've never heard of a nature correspondent. Like, do they go and sit by the beehive or something? And go,
Yeah. Well, Attenborough was in the nature department.
I'm sitting at the bees behind me. If I speak any louder, they'll be disturbed.
Reporting live from a copse in Worcestershire. We go to
the air is thick here with what they are calling the electric butterflies.
Yeah.
Roll back to the British trenches.
Pause. Sorry. Just to quickly follow on from that banter there about nature correspondent. That guy Cyril Ray, who we saw at the beginning, I believe he was very big on doing the wine correspondent column. So there you go.
So he was the Jilly Gordon of his day.
All these people who are curiously, strangely unrelated to subjects about war.
Philip Schofield was a big wino, wasn't he? He was like the wine selector for Waitrose and stuff. So,
Was he?
For a while, when I used to walk past Waitrose, there was massive pictures of Philip Schofield and the Philip Schofield wine.
He's a connoisseur of many things, is old Philip, isn't he?
But that brand doesn't work so well anymore.
This was what the journalists wrote of a day drenched with blood and failure. The press didn't only fail to tell the truth, it told a greater lie to itself. Unflinchingly, the correspondents swallowed the hasty revaluation of the campaign offered later that day by the General Staff. This was now not a decisive battle, but the beginning of a war of attrition, and for a first day, the attrition had gone really rather well. It was to go on for years. It's principally that slaughter on the Western Front that we still commemorate on November's second Sunday. Bradford threw its share of heroes into that good day for England. 2 Old Pals regiments, got up from men who lived in the same streets and worked in the same factories, were cut to ribbons that morning on the Somme. The soldiering public did not, as Godkin had prophesied, have their say in the conduct of that war, because the journalists who were there, and what else were they there for, balked at telling them the truth. But the truth was there, in the papers, for all to see. The syndicated columns on the first page of the Bradford local paper told the expedient official lie. But on page 2, page 3, page 4, the endless casualty lists told a different story. At the front, communications were good. The next morning, the same papers could be read in the trenches as in Bradford. For the first time, the exploits of the common man, not kings, not statesmen, were the stuff of news. So, for the first time, the common man learnt that newspapers lied. Historians of the press mark World War I as a turning point in the public's respect for newspapers. For the first time, people began to say, "You can't believe what you read in the papers."
And I mean, from that passage there, it's interesting to go from that to read something like Oswald Spengler or some of those sorts of German writers from around this period, a little bit later in this period, with their total mockery of the idea of the free press. And I mean, when you see this sort of stuff, it does kind of bring home why some of those German writers were so contemptuous of the the kind of notions of freedom sold by the British and American regimes.
Yeah. Because what's going on under this, all of this notion of the press wielding this power, suppressing it at certain times, exploiting it at other times, hidden behind all that is that journalism is a very strong vector of social mobility for those people.
Truth is traditionally war's first casualty. At the Somme, no bugles sounded for journalism, but journalism was among the fallen. The press only broke ranks once, and that was at Gallipoli, a doomed episode. British and Empire troops were told to land right under the cliffs and the guns of the Turks to endure withering and lethal fire. An Australian journalist, Keith Murdoch, father of the present owner of the Times and the Sun, sniffed a good scandal and reported the disaster to the cabinet. It was largely due to Murdoch's reporting that the campaign was mercifully aborted. Murdoch proved that...
I didn't know that, by the way.
I had no idea about that.
Well, what seemed to have happened was there was a British correspondent out there called Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, and he sent a letter back to London, talking about the sort of what he perceived as the military mismanagement. The guy in charge was a commanding officer called Hamilton, and this letter was lost or stolen or something like that. So Keith Murdoch, who was a friend of his, basically did his own version of it, and in our words today, he kind of sexed it up. To persuade the cabinet that they needed to withdraw from the Dardanelles. And so it sort of emphasizes this point of the press becoming this power player. He was getting very close to people like Lord Northcliffe and various politicians and civil servants.
I had no idea that Rupert Murdoch's father was in the biz, was in the trade, as it were.
Yeah.
I knew that obviously later on, Murdoch inherited the business, right? They're sort of smaller but fairly large, that owned like one or two newspapers, right? By the time Murdoch started his career, but that was in the 50s or 60s, I guess. So this is 40 or 50 years before that.
I mean, I won't get into the whole thing about the Gallipoli campaign. There's people probably far better knowledge of history, but one of the sort of key things was that there was an underestimation of the manpower needed, and it was cut between, Kitchener and Churchill said you might need 50 to 70,000 men. And apparently the Greeks at that time had much better intelligence on the Turkish positions, and they said you probably need about 200,000 men. But ultimately the commanding officer, Ian Hamilton, wasn't kind of given the right level of resources and intelligence. And Murdoch, again, as I say, wanted to sort of, crowbar himself into a more influential position. And there was an inquiry about Gallipoli when Hamilton came back to Britain, and it was all kind of stacked with cronies and friends of Murdoch. So he got his way, and Hamilton kind of was the sort of scapegoat and in disgrace. And Churchill, to some extent, was obviously blamed for it as well. And some of the comments I had yesterday saying that when Churchill went into the trenches, that was kind of a form of atonement for the mess of Gallipoli.
In my headcanon version of history, based on nothing but emotion and loathing, that meeting between Kitchener and Churchill, Kitchener was pressing for more men and Churchill was pressing for less. I have nothing to base that on.
Yeah.
Other than my dislike of Churchill, but I want to pin it mainly on him as part of the narrative.
Yeah.
He did make a sorry, go on, Simon.
No, you go on.
Well, he did make a show of stepping down and taking responsibility for Gallipoli, didn't he?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's partly with his career in mind, isn't it? I mean, it's like they say in the thick of it. If I'd resigned a few days ago, I'd be prime minister by now. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you have done something wrong, resign very quickly, and you will probably come out of it all right. Even maybe more liked, possibly, because you stand out against other politicians, don't you? If you admit fault. I just had a question as well. This image on the screen, are these grenades on the guy's back?
Yeah, they're stick grenades. Yeah, like in Germans used in World War II. Yeah, same sort of thing.
Easier to throw.
Yeah, you get further with them.
The great war journalists could break censorship, provided they had the will to put the public interest before the national interest.
There is no example amongst the official correspondence, apart from the single episode, of any attempt to strike, to withdraw their services, which were helping the government a great deal.
But could you have blown the whistle on...
Sorry, this guy absolutely goes through me for some reason. I don't know why. Something about his manner that rubs me up the wrong way.
Military disasters on the Western Front without spreading alarm and despondency at home?
I believe the correspondents should have written what they had seen, should have reported what they themselves believed, and that this would have spread alarm and despondency, that would have been a very constructive thing during the First World War.
We spent our pay in some cafe and fought wild with it night and day.
At the end of the war, the correspondents received the ultimate accolade. One damp morning in December 1918, on the Hohenzollern Bridge over the Rhine, the press corps fell in for Sir Douglas Haig. The top generals shook each one by the hand and presented him with a little Union Jack. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have behaved like men." One correspondent confessed, "We were as pleased as little boys."
Oh, we'll never tell them. No, we'll never tell them. There was a front, but damned if we knew where.
Between the wars, thanks largely to the success of the newsreel, popular journalism flourished.
Billy the Bayswater Bruiser matched against Mickey the Chelsea Champ. First round contestants for title of Fattest Cat. Figures tell the story. Billy 22 pounds 12 ounces, Mickey 23 pounds 12 ounces. Mickey wins.
Journalism was now no longer a job for gentlemen.
So, I mean, that's an interesting. I mean, that's not just random imagery there of the cats. Again, it maybe falls to Curtis's love of inserting funny animals into things. Because let's remember his first job was the dog who says sausages. But that inflection point there, at the end of World War One, that's that contrast between Kitchener there, patting the journalists on the back, well done boys, you've told it the way we wanted to. And our chum Nicholas Hiley there basically saying no, journalists need to report military incompetence. They need to kind of strike at the heart of the establishment in that way. So we get to World War II, or into the 30s at least, and journalism, as he says, is now in the narration now focusing on popular journalism. Effectively, this is kind of like the birth of slop in a way. This is sloppyism and slopaganda that's being churned out to distract the eye while it's this tone that you get in World War II, like you see in newsreels. There's always British squaddies with a sort of mug of tea in their hand and some sort of jolly narration, kind of keeping your eye off the darker footage, the sort of stuff you might see in like The World at War, that's a bit grimmer. But there's always a kind of, chaps in the desert frying eggs on the side of their tank kind of thing. So this is a different tonality here because the press have been reined in. They've been brought into an agreement with the government. Sorry, go on.
But they don't show you men trying to stuff their organs back in, crying out for their mother.
Yeah, not so much of that.
No. I was just going to remark on television. Television was first started being tested in about 1929. And
That's right.
BBC started broadcasting TV to a pretty small audience, but a few tens of thousands of people in, I think, 36, with some like earlier experiments before. But BBC TV was then cancelled as soon as the war started and didn't start up until after the Second World War. In America, there was no TV until after the Second World War. I think, Britain was actually slightly ahead. But, so the Second World War was, again, a radio and newsreel war, but not television war, whereas obviously that changed in the 50s and 60s.
Gentlemen, it was for eager newshounds like O.D. Gallagher of the Daily Express. When what Evelyn Waugh called a nigger war in Abyssinia broke out, the editor of the Express sent for...
Sorry.
Demonetized.
It's not even your fault.
No, I'm just I'm laughing. I'm laughing at Evelyn Waugh end posting on Maine.
Disavow.
He was, after all, a South African. He'd know the place.
I was sent around through various corridors and I've got innumerable jabs for everything you can think of, yellow fever, everything you can think of. And after that, to Gives, the great then outfitters, I don't know if they still are, service goods. I was advised to buy a pith helmet, and I did.
On the subject of Evil in War, one of the best cigar smoking techniques I've ever seen. If you watch that interview with him on that show, there's like a series of interviews that was done in the 50s with various interesting figures. And we watched the Evil in War one once, and he had this ability to not touch the cigar. He just has it in his mouth, puffs it, and then like takes a puff every minute or so, but it just stays in his mouth. I can't do that. Yeah, it's a very masterful technique if you're into cigars.
Interesting little clip here of Gallagher talking about going off to Geeves and Hawkes at number 1 Savile Row, the gentleman's tailor of record. Interesting little side note.
That's just something else that was picked up on in this. There's a lot of Scottish names in this, aren't there? Like, it's interesting how much the British Empire was populated by Scots. Like we had Ian Hamilton a little while ago. That sounds like a Scottish name. We had Gallagher a minute ago. You know,
bit like
Phil
the Blair
Marshall,
administration.
Douglas Haig was Scottish, wasn't he? The Blair government was all like half Scottish.
The British Empire was curiously Scottish. That is a really something I've noticed as well.
I felt rather proud of it. I think it was the last time pith helmets were worn, actually. Bought a gun, a shotgun, and odds and ends like that. Evil in War was much more sophisticated. If I could just mention him in passing, he did a very good job. He went straight to Faulkner and Mason, and the stocks of stuff he brought out to Abyssinia. He had everything: caviar, tinned ptarmigan, I don't know what. He had every mortal thing that was possible to take.
You mentioned Evil in War. Evil in War wrote up that episode in Scoop.
Yes.
A tremendous parody satire of journalists at war.
Yes.
How accurate was it?
Oh, dear. That book has long since been hailed, time and again, as a great satire. Never been touched by anybody like this before. In fact, the truth about Evil in War, on that occasion, is that he was an extremely bad reporter.
You mean it wasn't like that?
It wasn't at all like that. It was much funnier. It was much stupider.
Pause.
Hundreds of journalists piled into Addis.
Just interesting him there putting the boot into Evil in War there. I mean, this chap Gallagher, he essentially wrote for the Daily Express. I mean, to translate that to today's terms, that's kind of like your average kind of Conservative or UKIP voter kind of profile. But the fact that he kind of, sort of counter signals war there, war, I guess, perhaps more of a classically reactionary Catholic kind of figure. By contrast, Gallagher wrote a book called Retreat in the East, which was about the Abyssinian War. And in the dedication to that book, can you guess who it's dedicated to? To Mr. Churchill, in admiration and in wonder that he ever sleeps. So he's a bit of a suckbutt, this guy.
The Evil in War, by the way, he wrote that book Brideshead Revisited, right? Yeah. When I was at Oriel College, Oxford, in about 2004, 2005, Oriel College is like Tory central in Oxford for some reason. Like all of the young Tories are there, and huge numbers of them are gay as well. I don't know what that thing is about the gay Tory, but it's a big thing. And a lot of them were massive Evil in War fans. They like idolized it, and they loved Brideshead Revisited. And they dressed like they were characters from Brideshead, with the white kid gloves, cape. Like they actually minced it up, wearing capes. And I was kind of like, there was a mixture of, like, because obviously I love the cape, right? So there was a mixture of kind of like, I kind of love this, but I also like, what the hell is going on here as well? It's just kind of weird.
Well, there's the campery, isn't there? There's in Brideshead. I mean, I love Brideshead, but in that story, it's the kind of contrast between, the sort of aristocracy and the kind of Oxbridge, what they call the aesthetic set in Brideshead, and there's some sort of fun characters in there. But by contrast as well, you've got also Evil in War's Sword of Honor trilogy, which Peter Hitchens is very big on. I will say that.
I mean, the other weird thing about that set of people at Oriel, I don't know if they're still there, but is that they kind of like hung around forever. Like they were kind of like, are you a student here, or like what do you actually do? Like they were just kind of permanently there. Like I think they did like PhDs that endlessly got deferred, or they never. Oh, I've been writing up for 10 years.
Yeah.
Like, what? Yeah, they just kind of dug the lifestyle.
They loved
just
them,
hanging
yeah.
about, prancing about,
Yeah.
drinking port and wearing capes and things like that. So very
I
strange team.
That is understandable, especially if you've got a bit of money, right? Because I remember when uni came to an end, and I was like, oh, right, I've actually got to be an adult now, and it wasn't very appealing. If they were like brought up a bit like not looking forward to adulthood, then it is the comfiest, cushiest place. I mean, you just stand around talking about ideas. It's great. It's lovely.
I just remember some of the conversations I had around that time, and I was like, I used to say things like, I'm not sure about this Tory. I'm from Wales. I'll never be a Tory. And remember this one guy, his name was William or something. Again, extraordinarily posh characters, and he was just really like, one day you'll see the light. He said, things like that. It was kind of a very odd scene, but anyway, and again, as I've mentioned before, once midnight came, it just became a gay predatory space. So you'd be talking to someone, and their leg would be creeping up, their hand would be creeping up your leg. I'd be like, right, time for bed then, time for me to go. So it was a lot of that sort of stuff too. But anyway, let's carry on.
Ababa and hacked out their storyline. Heroic feudal tribesmen against the fascist might of Mussolini's absurd imperialist pretensions. Apart from Evelyn Waugh, and of course the man from the Times, this was a hard-bitten crew of newsmen hungry for a scoop and ready to cheat, bribe and steal to get it.
George Steer of the Times, the great George Steer with all his facilities and access to the British consulate, would type out his masterpieces analysing these battles and heaven knows what, which he would get from these privileged sources. But anyway,
You're muted, I
said sorry to say this is going to look like it's going to be a two-parter. We're only 16 minutes through here. We've talked quite a lot today.
How long is this one?
I mean, it's a whole hour.
Oh,
we're only 16 minutes through, so we're going to have to call time. Let's hit the 2-hour mark and we'll call time.
I encouraged his young runner to call and have the drink. So, of course, I'd have a very quick look at the stuff and extract whatever I thought was suitable for the Express. And that was that. Didn't extract a great deal because his messages to the Times were so infernally long and complicated, analysing battle after battle, and Express readers, I don't think, would have cared a hoot about them.
So you pinched from George Steer of the
Oh,
Times.
yes.
Where did George Steer get his stuff from?
He got his stuff basically from the British consulate.
Pause. Just have to say, I mean, he admits there openly that, I mean, he cribs his stuff off the guy from the Times and essentially edits it down for the man, who reads the Express, who he thinks basically wants to kind of, take out the intellectual content and cut to the chase. And that's what he gives them. There's an interesting contrast between George Steer, who wrote for the Times, and Evelyn Waugh. There's a blurb about them on the Faber and Faber website about Waugh versus Steer, and it was said of their first meeting, their trains went in opposite directions, and so did their dispatches and their politics. Waugh championed the Italian cause, and Steer was in favour of the Ethiopian rebels. So there you go. Waugh backed the fash. Oh, you're on mute, eh?
Yeah, he was a very reactionary character, wasn't he, Evelyn Waugh?
Yeah.
I know he was a Catholic and opposed Vatican II. I try to remember like what they used to go on about, but he was like a proper, didn't like our friends in the Middle East, that special country and so on.
Was he a homo himself?
I think he. There was question marks about that. But he did have kids, even more. He was married and he had kids. So
A sort of genuinely right wing but homosexual person is like a breed you don't see so much now. It's sort of become more mandatory, I think, among homos, unless they're completely isolated from each other. to join in the general leftism that like the the LGBT world got incorporated into. Do you know what I mean? Like it's standard now if you're a homo of either sex, I think, to be a leftist and to be concerned about racism and anti-Semitism, and all this.
I would say though, how can I say, they certainly over-index on our side of things as well, though.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can think of about 10.
all sorts of eccentrics are overrepresented on every sort of peripheral identity.
My former co-host, of course.
Yeah.
Greg. Milo. I mean, there's a lot of them. I mean, or formerly Milo.
Yeah, don't include Milo.
There's quite a lot of them around, I would say.
And
in Tory circles, I mean, it's I reckon the ratio is probably about 9-1 homo to straight.
I mean, the notion of the gay mafia is not a joke. They
Lavender mafia, yeah.
Yeah, they generally do try to prefer each other for power positions, I think. So.
The British consul, his name was Everett Colson. Everett Colson had a beautiful young daughter. Steer was an enterprising, upcoming Times reporter, and South African, incidentally. He fell in love with her, and they became engaged. Right, he had got the entree to the British legation, and that was the main source of military information to the British government.
But O.D., you really fell down on the job there. Why didn't you get engaged to the British consul's daughter?
I wasn't the right type, I'm afraid, not the right class. We were regarded as roustabouts and uncouth and one thing and another. In fact, we're called so. We didn't mind.
Abyssinia was the first war fought by press release. Haile Selassie, Lion of Judah, Jan Hoi, had precious little else to fight it with. He kept the press corps tucked up in Addis Ababa's hotels, starved them of news, and fed them instead heroic communiques. It worked very well. Haile Selassie got the sympathy of the world's press, and the world got a view of the war as remote from reality as was Fleet Street from the doomed highlands of Abyssinia.
Haile Selassie used us. And whenever he wanted to make a political statement, he would do what they do today. What the politicians of today and the generals of today do. He wrote a press release. He used us consistently with his own statements, replying to the Italian statements made at the League of Nations or wherever it might be. When I read in the papers, as everybody did, about the various criticisms of the handling or mishandling of the Falklands news and so on, my first thought went straight back to Jan Hoi. I thought, here's old Haile Selassie come to life again. He really did know it.
I feel like Selassie's come up before in these documentaries, hasn't he? Various times. I feel like we've talked about him previously.
Yeah, come up a lot in jungle music and reggae.
He made a very good Ministry of Defence spokesman.
Even in these difficult days, Britain maintains her freedom of the press. So the boys who will report the war in news and pictures push out to brave the dangers of the fighting zone. He'll have a hard job hiding from them.
At the outbreak of World War II, the government was prepared for the problems of journalism at war. Within 2 days, the Ministry of Information was created. This time, journalists weren't going to be coaxed and flattered into cooperation. They'd do as they were told or suffer the consequences.
It was the fiercest censorship that I ever came across. We were never allowed to go anywhere, and when we got somewhere, there was nothing to see anyway. And I attacked them and by telephone, by cable, by letter, all of which were censored, and I knew they were. And then I was called by the Director of Military Intelligence, General McFarlane, who later became Governor of Gibraltar. He says, "You are being sent home, Gallagher," and for improper behaviour, so I was sent home.
Well, in the first 6 months of the war, of course, we got absolutely nothing out of the Ministry of Information at all. It simply didn't issue photographs. During the first phony war period, we published 8 blank pages of pictures. And under each one, we put a caption, something like, "We thank the Ministry of Information for this picture of a British bomber dropping bombs on Dusseldorf." Well, this, of course, caused a very bad smell.
But the shadow boxing with the censors lasted.
Horrors.
This guy, Tom Hopkinson, I've read a bit about him and Picture Post. Picture Post doesn't exist anymore, or I don't think so. I think it may have been merged into another paper or something. But Picture Post was huge for about 20 years, starting in the mid to late 30s. And it was started by a guy called, it was owned by some Tory guy, but it was subversive and hard left. It was edited by this guy, Istvan Reich, who was called Stefan Laurent. Was his English name, but he was like a Jewish refugee, well, political refugee from Hungary. But by refugee, I mean he joined Bela Cohen's communist regime, like Bolshevik regime in Hungary. And a lot of people who were part of that regime obviously left the country afterwards because they tried to impose communism on the country, and a horrible regime at that. But he was then just free to move into Britain and become like a leading figure in the British press. Just absolute. Oh, he also owned Lilliput magazine, a little smaller circulation magazine. But he was just allowed to like vehemently attack the government, you know, because we have a genuinely free press in Britain, pretty like in peacetime, to a large extent. And Picture Post really, really had an impact on the public. I have the impression, from what I've read, that Picture Post may have played a pivotal role in convincing the public, a section of the public, to support the war before the war, in the sort of the year before Britain declared war on Germany. A really, really malignant thing, but very clever. You look at Picture Post stuff; it is brilliantly put together.
Yeah.
It's superb, like anti-fascist propaganda of a kind that most anti-fascists are not capable of. It was really well judged. It had the common touch. They put loads of interviews and pictures of common people just doing normal things, and people wanted to read that. People wanted to look at those pictures. You know, just people like them sitting on the front doorstep or something, or on holiday, or just out bicycling or whatever. Just that was really appealing to a lot of the public. And in the middle of that, they mixed in fear about Hitler, fear about Mussolini and stuff, and just the need to join up with the Soviets.
Yeah. Yeah, for American viewers, it was very similar to Life magazine, sort of exquisite photography, that kind of thing.
Yeah, from what I've seen, the photography is superb. It is as good as you can. What they were trying to do, they did it to a T. It was really clever.
Only as long as the phony war itself. On May the 10th, the German army exploded into action, surging through northern France and Belgium, the Blitzkrieg. Within a fortnight, the British army had fallen back to the coast, and the journalists were back in London. The War Secretary Anthony Eden gave orders for a secret evacuation. The French, still hoping for a joint Allied counterattack, aren't informed, nor is the British public. There's a news blackout on all but the blandest communiques. On May the 28th, General Mason McFarlane, O.D. Gallagher's old enemy, summoned the war correspondents to a secret meeting at the Berkeley Hotel in London. As Director of Military Intelligence, he told the press assembled in an upstairs room how bad the news was and what was now their duty. "I'm afraid there's going to be a considerable shock for the British public," he said. "It's your duty to act as shock absorbers." By then, the Dunkirk evacuation had been underway for 2 days. McFarlane sent the journalists down to Dover. They met a badly defeated and demoralized army. But what they saw was not what they reported.
I wasn't at Dunkirk, but I went down to see the troops coming back. And some troops came back in a shocking state. Morale had gone to ribbons, throwing their rifles away on the railway line between Dover and London, saying the buggers will be here tomorrow. And but other troops arriving with their boots clean and their faces shaved and all the rest of it. Well, obviously, the censor wouldn't have let you say that people were throwing their rifles away.
The press absorbed the national shock by seizing on the only positive angle to the Dunkirk story, the miracle of the evacuation. There was no mention of the defeat that had made the evacuation necessary. This film of a barefoot and bedraggled army struggling home wasn't shown. The British public, it was felt, couldn't take it. What they got instead, complete with stirring music, was this.
While these men live and breathe, Britain is safe. The enemy will never pass.
When facts are removed from information, what's left is called propaganda. The government saw it as a necessary evil, and the newsmen agreed. In Britain's darkest hour, the press now saw its duty defined with a dazzling clarity.
I happened to have a dinner, meet at a private dinner party, Anthony Eden, who was then the Minister of War. And he told me, with facts and figures, just what the state of the military resources of the country was. We had indeed got men back from Dunkirk, but they were men who'd come back without tanks, without armoured carriers, mainly without rifles even. And it was going to take a very long time before they could be made into a real fighting force. And he said the Germans have taken over the airfields in northern France, and they are increasingly making those in Kent and the south coast inoperable. He said they now have control of the air within 30 miles of London, and if they should get control of the air over London, we're finished. In this moment, I realised that my task as an editor in this situation is not to tell the British people the truth. There is something more important than telling them the truth. I felt most profoundly that it would come right in the end.
Pause.
But the truth in 1940...
Well, yeah, it is a really interesting point here that we had that narration earlier. When facts are removed from information, it becomes propaganda. As we've talked about previously, I mean, the best propaganda is the stuff you kind of really don't really notice. But if you think about it these days, the sort of propaganda you're exposed to now, it's absolutely chock full of facts. Because nowadays we have this sort of cost accountancy view of everything, and every conversation has to be kind of scienced, and everything has to have a citation, and there's always a comprehensive rebuttal, sort of 5 or 10 factoids, with which to push back against this argument. These kind of articles get, the predominance of the fact checker, is kind of the way that propaganda works now. But again, it's you absorb it, and you sort of don't notice it's happening. And again, this is this strange thing about propaganda that you think it's not something being done to you. It lives in us. It's people's desire to kind of oscillate these days between either the kinds of responses I get yesterday on the Churchill tweet. They either oscillate between sort of combative, angry rationalism. Well, these are the facts. These are the citations I'm going to give you. This is my rebuttal. Or people oscillate into a sort of dreamy, sort of supine nostalgia about things. And the problem is you get this very polarized discourse in which people can only kind of accept information in a single mode of authenticity. It's either what they feel is emotionally true, spiritually true, as he goes on to say here, or it's this sort of combative rationalism where people challenge things constantly to the point of ad absurdum, or just political paralysis, or they exist in a kind of dream state about the world.
I mean, the counterfactual would be, what would have happened if the British public had been told the truth in this moment? Would it have just killed morale? Would it have been demoralized? Would they have lost the war?
Do you know what?
Right. That's always the supposition.
This was June 1940, I think. Dunkirk, is that right? Sure, yeah. So the German attack on France started in May and was completed by early July. I think that's right. So this is probably in June, I believe, right? That first 10 months or whatever it was since the first declaration of war, historians, except a few, seem to have avoided the question of how firmly the public was on board. But there's one book I read called Truth Betrayed, which is about the media at war, right? The media before the war as well, but especially going into the war. And it's by W.J. West, who I think not particularly regarded by the historians, doesn't seem to be cited by the historians, but maybe writing popular history and probably right-leaning, probably very right-leaning actually. And just not mentioned by many other people, but I found him in a citation in one other book. But he talks about the radio war, and I've never heard of that before. Have you ever heard of the radio war? I mean, maybe it's just his term, but in the first, I mean, this started before Britain declared war as well, but certainly in those 10 months, the German the pro-German broadcasts by people like William Joyce, who became called Lord Haw, but his name was just William Joyce, and was executed after the war. And not that many people were, but he was. Those broadcasts were being listened to apparently by more people than were listening to the BBC, which was the state propaganda body and total monopoly at that point. William Joyce's broadcasts for peace, basically, on behalf of Germany, but he was an Englishman. Well, he was Canadian, I think. Those broadcasts were outdoing the BBC for listenership. They were that message was being heard. Like, basically, your leaders are bastards, and they've dragged you into this wrongly, and it's going to destroy you. And that was winning. That message was winning. So this is the context of this need to carefully marshal the public's awareness and responses to things. Is that there was huge doubt about the war. People were basically being forced into it. I would also cite what started after Churchill took over under the BBC. It may have been at his orders, I'm not sure, but the anger campaign, which was literally just demonizing Germany and justifying the bombing of their cities, especially. I mean, war, some people will get on board with, but bombing of cities, people were not used to that. Obviously, that was new. There was some attacks on civilians in the First World War from the air, but it was not thought of in the same way as area bombing in the Second World War. And obviously the attacks on Coventry and places like that as well. People had to be brutalized and lied into it. And I think this should all be considered as part of that, because that is, have you ever heard of the anger campaign? It's not much mentioned. You go to the Imperial War Museum, they don't talk about the anger campaign, but it did happen. It was a BBC initiative, probably out of Downing Street. And so there maybe was a need to, from the warmonger's point of view, there maybe was a need to do this. It doesn't make that much sense out of that context.
There's a curious parallel with the German campaign, the Lord Haw and all that, with the Russian campaign during this war, during the Ukraine one, whereby you could argue that the Russians have had quite a good deal of success getting their narrative out there. To the extent where it's arguable that even some people close to the president believe that version of events. It's possible, isn't it?
Yeah, and this mistrust that they're accused of fostering. Well, it would work very well if it were that to be the case, that they were fostering that mistrust of the institutions and the establishment. I mean, the interest for me here in this bit of discussion about with this guy Hopkinson is this moment where he's talking about meeting, Anthony Eden, the Minister of War, and essentially it's this kind of devil's handshake moment that Eden says, "Well, listen, old boy, it's not going terribly well," and Hopkinson kind of takes from that an understanding that his job is to essentially suppress the truth at this moment, and it's this moment where the investment from the mighty. It gives journalists this sense of grandeur and importance and responsibility, because it plays to their vanity, and their sense of mission. And then that, of course, has a virtuous feedback loop of driving their loyal support to regime, because they know it enriches their access and their resource levels. But you wonder who is kind of flattering who.
The partnership between politicians and journalists is one of the least admirable things in all of humanities. One of the most malign alliances I can think of.
I'm trying to remember when at the start of the stream we were talking about the veneration of the intrepid journalist. I think it was a combination of the George Bush presidency and the Obama presidency that truly killed that off, didn't it? During the Iraq War, there were lots of people, like there was a kind of purge of critical voices, certainly voices critical of Israel, but also voices critical of the Iraq War on American corporate news during that time. I mentioned Jesse Ventura before. He got a show on CNN or something, or MSNBC, I can't remember which one. He was set to start this show in 2003, and it was cancelled. Richard Spencer's talked about this as well, how it wasn't just Jesse Ventura, it was a lot of anti-war voices were purged from American media. right and left during the Iraq War. And then when Obama became the president, Obama ran a lot of things where he just like the press would basically report his press release, and that was it. That was it. Like, so the press just became almost like a kind of arm of the Obama administration.
Max Blumenthal always uses the phrase stenographers for power.
It's interesting when you think about that period as well, where you have someone like Alistair Campbell in the UK attempting to kind of manage, I guess, the output of the regime. And it's sort of, the press is probably aware that they're being cut out of, they're being disintermediated. These days, obviously, people can say, Trump can go on Twitter and just talk directly to the people. But at that point, Campbell was trying to sort of perform a gatekeeping function. But maybe that's the kind of reason why people went for him later, with the really put the boot in on the dodgy dossier. Just an attempt to kind of manage that stuff, but it's depriving the Fourth Estate of its power base by ordering them around.
I remember, one thing that journalists argue with other journalists about is like, are you an access journalist? If you're an access journalist, you're not really a journalist, right? You're not really trying to get at the truth. You're trying to just get whatever the president wants to give you, sort of thing. And I remember, as you mentioned, during the George W. Bush time, they really were quite hostile to journalists. They really they enjoyed slagging them off and stuff. And they made it so that with the Iraq War, the key thing was embeddedness. If you could be one of the embedded journalists, you get all that you want. You get the K-80 shots in the background and all this, explosions in the background and that. And you get fed all the info. If you're not embedded, you get nothing, and you're kind of a traitor. So it's obey us or you get nothing, And it was so they're using their privilege.
Well, a lot of the things that Trump has been criticized for, like cutting out, like not allowing Associated Press to go and cutting off access to the White House and all that sort of stuff. I believe that all those tactics were used by Obama and by Blair and even by the Bush administration too. It's just a matter of, if you're not on board, you're gone. Basically, you don't. But what would happen in those days? It wouldn't be like, oh, this newspaper is banned. It'd be that specific journalist. And if you watch enough Blair when he was the actual prime minister, he knew them all by name, right? That's like, he'd always be like, oh, Jill or Rupert or whatever. He knew every journalist by name, and so if one of them asked him a question that he didn't quite like, they'd curiously be gone from the press corps the next time, and that's kind of the tactics that Mandelson used. He'd be on to the blower to the Sun the next day, or whoever it was, the BBC, make sure that one's gone, type thing. So anyway, and so they did tame the press to a certain extent. New Labour did.
Sorry.
And then, if you remember, they were pretty critical of the Cameron government austerity and all of that. They weren't. The Cameron government never got the same. The Tories never got the same obedience from the press that the Blairites were able to get.
Just as social media is beginning to flourish in the late 2000s.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be really interesting to know how Blair and his team would manage social media now. But actually, I reckon we've kind of seen what they've done. They just kind of dominated themselves. I saw GB News, right, earlier today or yesterday, had a spokesman on from the Tony Blair Institute selling digital ID as a cure to immigration.
Control migration, yeah. There we go.
Yeah, I mean, all right, so...
Was it 40 Labour members have come out in favour?
Yep. A month after Blair met with private meetings with spot rising talent, now there's this spontaneous clamour among Labour MPs asking for digital ID. It's funny that.
And predicted on the subject of immigration, as you said.
And now it's literally being fed to GB News viewers directly by the Tony Blair Institute. So,
I mean, I wonder, does does Tony Blair himself meet up with Paul Marshall? Because GB News, I increasingly think of as just Paul Marshall's news microphone. You know, maybe I should have always seen it that way. Well, he bought it not long after it was founded, I think, wasn't it? But it is increasingly just a containment op, and it sort of reminds us that we're not just talking about politicians meeting the journalists. That Tom Hopkinson who was on screen a minute ago, he was co-editor of Picture Post, I think, or maybe editor by this time. I'm not sure, because that Istvan Reich was busy with other things as well. But yeah, like obviously politicians have access to the editors and the owners, and there are instances in history, like with the Lord Boothby Roddy Cray scandal, where the owner of the paper just shuts down their own journalists, and it is as flat and as simple as that. Stop reporting that. Stop your investigation. We're not reporting on that, and don't ask why. You know, that does happen fairly often, and obviously the owner of the paper has the power to do that.
Yeah, there's a couple of good people at GB News. Edgington, I can see mentioned there, and a couple of other friends we've got. But in general, you're right. Yeah, in general, it is a kind of. But I my sense is that a lot of the people there are pretty aware of that as well. You know, they're aware of the constrictions that they have to work within. But anyway, chaps, we have hit the 2-hour limit. So if you just remember this timestamp, 24 minutes we're in. That's how far we'll do. But this is quite a good one to do a two-parter on, because it's an extremely interesting topic.
Yeah,
there was a lot we had to talk about. There are a few super chats. Studio Rayner has done a triple super chat here. He said the Poles are making a racket selling EU citizenships. He also says, how much does an EU passport cost? Does the City of London have its own passport? It doesn't have its own passport, does it? City of London, it just the king has to have permission to go in or something. And he also says Churchill sacrificed the greatest empire ever to exist. He ruined everything.
For shame. Boo, boo.
Crispy GT has just sent $1.23 Australian cents, is it? Horwitz, Feinberg and Horwitz has just sent $5. Thank you very much, sir. Name. And Mr. Webster says, I would appreciate a historical video or stream with you, Simon and Horace, on Bush and Obama period throughout the 2000s and early mid to 2010s history. Well, we kind of done some of it through Curtis, haven't we? What was the one about the Afghanistan war and the underground tunnels and all of that?
When we were talking about the trap, I think.
The Power
of Nightmares.
Power of Nightmares covered a lot of that period, didn't it?
And there's not just one of these bases. There's several of them. You've got a Rumsfeld with those bases in Tora Bora. They got loads of these as well. Yeah,
the secret underground.
Drive a tank down the corridors.
It's interesting. All right, well, I will just remind people, by course, is promo code Mandy, of course. I admire it so much. Horace, do you want to just do your plug again for the people who didn't catch it earlier?
I'll plug one of my essays that I wrote last year that relates to this. It talks about Picture Post that we just saw a bit of, and various other things about the media in the 30s. It's called A Conflict of Philosophies. It's on my Substack, eternalhorace.substack.com.
And Simon, anything you want to mention?
I'm still on Twitter at Simon__Roberts, and I'd like to shield that next Thursday, I'll be on Proper Horror Show's channel again, talking about folk horror. We're going to be reviewing the film A Field in England, and I think we might be joined by young Master Harry Robinson from the Lotus Eaters. So we'll see how that goes.
Old based Harry, eh? Okay, well, I will see everybody again. Well, live, he'll be next Tuesday, but I do have a video tomorrow as well. So, bye, everyone.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.